So what I usually do is tell a little bit about my career and then talk about dogs. My first career was, I was in movie marketing. I was president of marketing for TriStar Pictures, and I was the least successful marketer in the history of Hollywood. I buried more movies than any other 10 people. And we're talking about movies with pretty big stars. Bruce Willis, I killed Sunset and Blind Date, Arnold Schwarzenegger, Red Heat and Running Man, Meryl Streep, Still of the Night. Just jump in if you saw any of these, okay? All right. George Lucas and Jim Henson, who are arguably two of the top names in family entertainment, I killed a movie that both of them collaborated on, called Labyrinth. Lucas, I know. More people are in this room than saw Labyrinth on opening weekend. So by the time I left movie marketing, there were no directors or producers hanging on my ankles, getting me to stay, begging me to stay. So I decided, so I wrote a script, and it sold. So all of a sudden I was a screenwriter. But when you guys probably know this living out here, when you're a nobody screenwriter, when you're a B-list screenwriter, they look for reasons not to make your movie. So even if they buy it, so I sold 10 feature scripts, none of which got made. And one day I was at a meeting at Warner Brothers talking about a script they had bought. And they look for reasons not to make it because, you know, if you hire Aaron Sorkin to write a movie and it fails, what can you do? You hire Aaron Sorkin. If you hire David Rosenfelt and it fails, you can get in trouble. So I was in this meeting at Warner Brothers and they were looking for a reason not to make it, and I knew it. And they decided that it's not credible enough, that everything had to make perfect sense, that people had to behave credibly. And I just knew it wasn't true, but I knew I was dead, and it was really frustrating. So that night I went to see a movie called The River Wild. Anybody see that? A friend of mine produced it. And I'm watching that movie, and Kevin Bacon, Meryl Streep is a whitewater rafting genius, and she's out with her family, including her wimpy husband, who's like never been outdoors in his life. And Kevin Bacon is an escaped convict, and he takes him prisoner. He takes him hostage, because Meryl Streep is the only one good enough to get him down this raging river to safety. About a quarter of the way through the movie, the husband escapes, and he spends the rest of the movie going along the side, and he sets a trap for them at the end when they get there. So I'm watching this movie, having been tortured by credibility questions that afternoon, and I'm thinking, if the wimpy husband can go down the side and wait for them, why does Kevin Bacon need Meryl Streep to get him down the river? Right? It drove me insane. So a friend of mine was a TV movie producer director, and he got me to write a TV movie, and that's the perfect environment for me, because you need no artistic credibility or artistic integrity whatsoever. Okay, you just write what they tell you, and you cash the check. So I sold a bunch of TV movies, and 3 of them got made. And each one was worse than the one before. And the last one was called Deadly Isolation. And it was about a woman who lived on the coast of Maine. Her husband had died 2 years earlier, and she lived with her elderly golden retriever. And she was still in mourning. And there was going to be a political regatta off the coast 3 weeks later with some big-time politicians on it. And a guy comes to the house, pretends to be a friend of her dead husband, and he's injured, and he scams her. And he gets her to fall in love with him so he could stay in the house for 3 weeks so he could commit an assassination. So Lifetime bought the movie, but they didn't want it to be an assassination movie. They wanted it to be that the ex-husband and the scam guy were jewel thieves together. and the husband died before they could divvy up the jewels, and the bad guy thinks the jewels are in the house, so that's why he wants to get there. So I said, if the bad guy thinks the jewels are in the house, if I was him, instead of spending 3 weeks scamming the woman, I would tie her up and search the house, right? But they didn't want to do that, and I don't care. They could have said they want the aardvark to be a bad guy, I've been fine with it. So the movie was so bad that there was a scene in the script where the guy and the woman and her elderly golden retriever go out on the ocean on her boat. And when she's not looking, he throws the dog into the ocean. I'm not going to kill this dog, trust me. So he could then jump in and rescue the dog and look like a hero and get her to fall in love with him. All right? It's brilliant stuff. So it was a low-budget Canadian movie, and they didn't have the money to go out on the ocean. So they went out on what was like a viaduct, right, of placid water. And the guy throws the dog into the water, and the dog is swimming happily along. It was just horrible. So then one day I wrote a novel on a whim. I wrote it in 5 weeks, and a publisher bought it with 3 sequels. So now all of a sudden I was a novelist, right? But the one thing I'm noted for in my books is I make stupid mistakes all the time, okay? For example, in New Tricks, Andy's girlfriend, Lori, gets shot in the thigh, and she almost bleeds to death. And at the time, a real-life Washington Redskins player named Sean Taylor died that way. But I wrote in the book that she was shot in the thigh, and the reason she bled so much is that the bullet severed her carotid artery. Right? It's actually in the book, right? I wrote in Airtight that they found the victim lying face down on his back. Right? So, the other thing I don't do is I don't do any research at all. All right? I mean, 0. So in the first book, Andy's a lawyer, right? And Andy, his first case is a guy named Willie Miller, been on death row for 7 years for a murder he didn't commit. And Andy takes the case on an appeal, and Willie's like 6 weeks from execution. And of course he gets him off. After the book came out, I learned that New Jersey doesn't have a death penalty. So poor Willie sat on death row in a state with no death penalty. It was really quite sad for him. But so that book came out, that was called Open and Shut, and that did okay. And the second book was called First Degree. And at the time, Publishers Weekly said I was one of the top 5 rising stars in mystery fiction. They have since retracted that with an apology to their readers. But that did okay, and then Bury the Lead was a Today Show book in a month, so that did well, and then the next 2 just did okay. Oh, but the 5th book was called Dead Center, and it's an example of my lack of research. So, Dead Center, it takes place in northern Wisconsin, and the crime, which I forget what it was, but it has to do with bringing things in across the border from Canada. The bad guys brought stuff in. So I write the book, and I send it to my publisher, and I tell her to read it, but in the meantime, I'm going to go to a map and check the names of towns and put in real town names where I had fake names. So I go to the map, and I find out that there is no border between Canada and Wisconsin. All right? Wisconsin is bordered by Minnesota, Michigan, and Lake Michigan, I think, but there's no border. So I had to completely rewrite it. And I had to have the bad guys fly it in over Lake Superior. So I had to get an airport in this dinky town. I had to do all kinds of things. And then I got creative, and Andy solves the crime. I don't remember it that well, but it has something to do with the bad guys didn't file a flight plan. That's somehow integral to the solution. And the book comes out, and every pilot in America emails me that you don't have to file a flight plan. Right? So even that didn't make sense. Anyway, so the sixth book was called Play Dead, and that was going to be the last Andy Carpenter. Just think what would have happened to American culture as we know it had he not survived. But it was the first book where a dog was important to the plot. So they put a golden retriever on the cover, and it sold twice as many books as any previous one. Right? So, therefore, the publisher asked me to write another one, and I don't know what's going to happen in the book when I start to write it. I literally can't think 3 pages ahead. So it just goes wherever it goes. And the publisher knows that, and they're fine with it. So I agreed to write the book, and a week later, before I'd even thought about what it might be about, they sent me the book jacket. And it has 2 dogs on the cover. It has a golden and a Bernese mountain dog. So I wrote the book to the jacket, right? Which I don't think that's how Hemingway used to do it, right? So that did okay. Anyway, then they just went on from there. This one that just came out is probably like number 26 or so. So since it takes me about 5 weeks to write a book, I decided I would write a second book each year, and I wrote standalone thrillers. And I'll just tell you about the first one. It was, well, our guy's in a bar on New Year's Eve, our hero, and somebody comes in and says, I just murdered a woman named Sheila in Kinnelon, New Jersey, and I buried her in a certain place. Now it's your problem. So our guy goes back and he Googles Sheila and Kinnelon to see if there's any missing person. Anyway, so we changed the title of the book just before it was going to come out. So I rewrote the scene. In rewriting the scene, I left out the name Sheila. So the guy doesn't mention Sheila. But our hero goes home and is Googling Sheila in Kinnelon, New Jersey, right? The other beauty was called Heart of a Killer, and it's about a woman in prison who has a heart defect. Whose daughter has a congenital heart defect, and a woman wants to give her her heart, thereby committing suicide, but letting her daughter live. Because she's the only perfect match for her daughter's heart. Anyway, so it's a long, boring story. It becomes a thriller and so on. But just before it comes out, a friend of mine who's he's a world-renowned hematologist from Johns Hopkins, and he reads the book and he says, I don't know how to tell you this, but you don't have to be a perfect match to do a heart transplant. It's not even important. And he said, if you did, it would be a sibling. So the entire premise of the book is bullshit, right? Anyway, then I wrote a book called Dogtripping, which was about our miserable trip from California to Maine with 25 rescue dogs. So I'll tell you a little bit of our rescue background. So we had a dog named Tara, a golden retriever, who was just wonderful. I know you think you have nice, great golden retrievers. Forget about it, okay? When she died, my wife wasn't ready to get another dog, so we started volunteering in shelters. And we volunteered at West LA, and it took about a year. And then one day we were in Baldwin Park, and we were in the lobby, and a guy comes in with his dog to turn the dog in. It was a year-old lab mix. And they had a thing at Baldwin Park, I don't know if they still do, but a thing at Baldwin Park, you had to sign a paper saying you understood the dog could be put down after an hour, okay? And they didn't, I mean, you know, unless it was way overcrowded, but that you had to sign that. So this guy there with his 3 kids, all like 10, 12 years old, and I hear them talking, and they had gotten that dog at Baldwin Park 10 months earlier. And now it was full grown, and they didn't want it anymore. So it wasn't cute anymore. So they were taking it, they were turning it in and going to get a puppy in the back. Right? So it was not my finest hour. My wife annihilated this guy in front of his kids in the shelter, in the lobby, right? While I stood off to the side, you know, whistling. So they left without getting another dog, but I'm sure they came back when the lunatics were gone. So we took that dog, and he became our first Rescue Foundation dog. And we started our foundation, and we rescued a lot of dogs. And what would happen is if we had a dog that was rescued a dog that was blind or epileptic or old or whatever, that people wouldn't want it, they came home with us. So when you have 2, getting a 3rd is a big deal. When you have 27, and the Lancaster shelter says they're going to be putting this golden down at 3 o'clock, you get 28. So we never had less than, in California, never had less than 25 in our house. We had 42 at one point. But we think that anything over 40 is eccentric. So we try and keep away from that. You could ask questions later if you want about our lifestyle. It's bizarre. It was bizarre. And but in 2011, we had bought a house in Maine like 4 years earlier. Actually, in 2007, our house was caught in the fires in the canyons here. And we were in the Irvine Marriott with 2 dogs, and the rest of the dogs had to stay with a friend who ran the Irvine shelter. And we thought we lost the house. And we had just bought a house in Maine to someday move into when my wife retired. So we didn't know what to do. We thought we'd have to move. So somebody emailed me from like Maryland who somehow knew, I didn't know, but knew that we were in California, and asked if we had any problem with the fires. And she was a rescue person, so I said, we do. We think we lost a house, and would you have any idea how we're gonna get to Maine? You know, how we can move all these dogs to Maine? So she didn't, but she must have put it out on the internet, because in the next 3 days, we got 171 responses from people saying that if you drive through here, you and your 27 dogs could stay at our house, right? 171 people. If you come through Topeka, stay with us, right? It was amazing. And it's like, it shows the dog culture, the subculture that's out there. Anyway, unfortunately, the house didn't burn down because my wife was head of media at Taco Bell, and MTV was gonna shoot our trip east as a reality TV show. So had the house burned down, I would be John Grisham today, right? But 4 years later, we were ready to move, and we had no idea how to do it. And finally, we decided to rent 3 RVs and 9 readers. We flew in 9 people we mostly didn't know. And we did this trip cross country. And it was horrible, right? It was, the other 10 people think it was the greatest adventure in their life. And it was horrible. We had 200 feet of plastic fencing. So every time we stopped, we had to set up our own dog park. And every time you stop, the dogs want to get off. And if you've ever driven an RV, which I never will again, they run out of gas every 20 minutes, right? You fill it up with gas, you drive 2 blocks, and you have a quarter of a tank left, right? I have like RV PTSD, right? So, anyway, it was fairly uneventful looking back, but it was horrible. So I wrote a book about it called Dogtripping, and it did really well. And then the book after that, which did much less well, but which I think is better than Dogtripping, is called Lessons from Tara. It's also about our time in rescue. So But anyway, so now we're in Maine, and it's terrific. It's absolutely terrific, and we have 12 dogs, because in New England there's no rescue problem. They bring hundreds of dogs every week up from the south, and they get placed immediately. Right? There's one little rescue in New Hampshire I did a benefit for. They bring 40 dogs up every week, and the dogs are spoken for before they get there. Right? So we have 12 dogs now. We have 5 of them are Mastiffs. Each is 200 pounds. We have 2 Goldens and 5 a Newfie and 4 assorted mutts. So that's basically my story. Sad though it may be, right? Anybody have any questions? Any questions? Sorry? We have 12 acres on a lake. It's beautiful. It's like waking up in a Folgers commercial, you know? No, the dogs actually, no. Because if they did, we couldn't get them back. We have 3 acres fenced in. And we have a doggy door like the Lincoln Tunnel, right? And they go in and out as they please. And we take some to the lake occasionally, but they have to be isolated. They can't just have the ability to roam free. Plus the lunatics in Maine do like duck hunting on the lake. So it's a weird dynamic. Everybody loves dogs, and yet they also hunt. I don't get it, but they do. I'm sorry, what? I didn't hear a word you said.
She's asking, do all your dogs need medication every day?
Oh, God. I was telling Barry, when we were in California, we would give out 60 pills or so every morning and night. Now, the 12 dogs, 4 of them are on medication, and so, I don't know, 15 pills, 30 a day. And they all, you know, some of them are on special diets, so it's complicated.
But do you have people helping you? Did you have that?
No. Never did, actually. We didn't even have people helping with the rescue. We had 1 volunteer. So that was tough. We placed 4,000 dogs over 5 years, and it was really tough. Anybody else?
What do you do with all the poop?
Where we are now, it's not a problem, because what it is now is, when you go through the doggy door, there's like, I don't know, 50-foot square cement area. And then there's an opening in that fence, and it leads out into 3 acres of woods. So what happens in the woods, we don't know about, all right? So it's really not a problem. When we were in Santa Monica, we were in a house with neighbors, like from the bottom of those steps to me. That's how close the houses were. And we had 35 dogs. So I wrote about this in one of the books. Just the urine smell was unbelievable, right, for the neighbors. So we tried to concoct ways to combat it. So one of them was, we brought in, I don't know why we did this, we brought in sand. We turned the backyard into a beach. But it didn't stop the smell, and the dogs tracked in the sand. It was horrible, right? So then we covered the backyard in borax, which is white and looks like Winter Wonderland, right? But it soon became yellow, right? It was disgusting. Finally, we put a fence up, and we made like a bowling alley down the center of the backyard, and that's where the dogs had to stay, so at least they were far from the neighbors. But we had to leave the doors open, so flies would come in, and Debbie bought something called a perfectly named product called the Big Stinky, which was a thing to ward off flies, and you had to put 1/4 pound of raw fish in it, It was just bizarre, absolutely bizarre lifestyle. And of course the barking, you know, like Halloween is the worst night of the year, you know. Now we live in the middle of nowhere, so there's nowhere that comes for Halloween, but it was just horrible, you know, so, yeah. Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you, and thank you for coming.